Hey everybody, it's time for Friday Fromage from the farm again. I'm Kate Johnson and I'm with the Art of Cheese, a little cheese making school in Longmont, Colorado. And every Friday I bring you Friday Fromage from the farm because my cheese making school is located on a farm. It's a dairy goat farm and sometimes we talk about goat cheeses, but today we are going to talk about melting cheeses. All right, so just want to real quick say happy belated Thanksgiving. Yesterday was Thanksgiving for those of us that celebrate Thanksgiving. And it was a different one, right? I didn't have a big family gathering. I had my mother here and that was it. And that's only because she and I have formed a little bubble and we try to stay pretty separate from everybody else. And then I delivered meals to my adult daughters who are much more exposed in the world, and we ate via Zoom. So anyhow, I hope you managed to make the most of it. It was actually a really fun Thanksgiving. It was quirky and it was weird, but we all felt good about doing our part. All right, so let's talk today about my subject. And my subject today is the meltability of cheese. Many of you who maybe have watched my Monday morning from the milk house know that I use another term, milkability of goats. But today we're going to be talking about cheese. And meltability of cheese is just such an interesting subject. And I've been doing some research on it lately because I've gotten some questions. And much of this is going to come from a great article I found on finecooking.com. So if you're curious and want a little more detail, that's where a lot of this comes from, as well as just from my own personal experience. All right, so what makes cheese melt? Why do some cheeses melt, some don't? Some melt better than others, and some just melt differently than others. And what exactly happens when cheese melts? So we're going to just talk about that a little bit today, and then I have kind of a fun little demonstration for you to illustrate some of the things I'm going to talk about. So the first thing is, what exactly is happening when your cheese is melting? Well, if you've ever noticed when you slice up your cheese and you put it on a cheese plate, especially on a warm day, if it's a high-fat cheese, a lot of times what you'll start to notice is little beads of fat come up to the surface on your cheese just sitting there at room temperature. Well, that's the first step of melting. So around 90 degrees, the solid milk fat in your cheese begins to liquefy a little bit. The cheese softens a bit and beads of this milk fat come up to the surface. Now it isn't truly melting yet, but it's starting to liquefy, which is the first stage of melting. As the cheese gets hotter and hotter, those bonds that are holding the casein together, the casein is the main protein in our cheese, those proteins start to break and collapse, and it causes them to turn into a thick fluid. Now, that's melting, right? But at what temperature that happens is going to depend a little bit on what cheese you're trying to melt. And whether or not your cheese will melt at all is also dependent on a few factors. So there basically are 4 factors that are going to influence the meltability of your cheese. I'm going to list the 4 factors first, and then I'm going to explain them all a little bit. The first one is the moisture content in your cheese. The second is the fat content. So there's a difference here. Moisture content would be water, basically. How much water is still in that cheese? The fat content would have to do with the amount of butter fat in the milk or cream that you use to make the cheese. Both of those have an effect on the meltability of the cheese. The third thing is the age of the cheese. Is it a fresh cheese or has it aged? Because things change over time. And then the fourth factor about whether or not your cheese will melt well is the acid content. And I would go a little further than not just the acid content of the cheese, how acidic is it, but how did that cheese become cheese? And that kind of backs up to like, what is cheese anyhow? Well, it's curdled milk, right? And it's milk where we've pulled out the solids and separated them from the liquids. And there's different ways that we get this to happen. And sometimes we do it just by heating up milk and adding an acid. And that's different than most cheeses, which is where we add a little bit of culture and then we add a little bit of rennet and that coagulates things, and then we do a little bit more steps to get the solids to separate. And those things not only affect the acidity, but also how that cheese coagulates in the first place. So those are the 4 factors: moisture content, fat content, the age of the cheese, and the acid content. And those are the 4 factors that are going to really depend on or influence how meltable your cheese is. So let's kind of go a little bit deeper with this just for a minute or two, and then I'm going to do a little demonstration to show you what I'm talking about. So first is the moisture content. All right, so a high moisture cheese, this would be a cheese that has retained a lot of the liquid or the water in the cheese or in the milk, because you know milk is made up a lot of water. When we make cheese, we're separating curds from whey. The curds are primarily the solids in the cheese, are in the milk, the butter fat, the protein, caseins, the minerals, and then the rest of it is liquid, which is essentially water. All right, so the moisture content in your cheese will make it easier or harder to melt. So high moisture cheeses, things like mozzarella, cream cheese, brie and camembert, these are high moisture cheeses. We think of these as the really soft cheeses, right? They're gonna melt easier than the harder, lower moisture cheeses like cheddar or Parmesan. And in fact, when I say they're gonna melt easier, it's a different temperature at which these cheeses start to melt. So those high moisture cheeses start to melt around 130 degrees. That's not all that hot. And then the next level, kind of a little bit lower moisture, say like cheddar and Swiss, it's about 150 degrees that those cheeses start to melt. And those really low moisture content cheeses like Parmesan, they don't start to melt till about 180 degrees. So it takes more heat to get them to melt. All right, so the moisture content in your cheese is gonna make a big difference. And then secondly, the fat content, all right? Higher fat cheeses melt better than lower fat cheeses. Have you ever tried to make a pizza and you tried to be a little healthier and use low fat or part skim mozzarella? It doesn't give you that same satisfying melty characteristic that the full fat mozzarella does, right? Because the fat content, it makes it more meltable. There's more of that fat to liquefy. And so fat content makes a big difference. All right, then the third thing is the age of the cheese. In a fresh cheese, the casein molecules are kind of large and stretchy. So think of mozzarella. And the way mozzarella melts is in a kind of stringy melting, right? When you've got that big, good, gooey pizza and you pull up a piece, there's strings of melted mozzarella there. And that's because that's a very fresh cheese. But in an aged cheese, those casein molecules have been broken into smaller pieces due to the ripening enzymes that are part of aging a cheese. So think about cheddar. While it does need a higher temperature to melt, when it finally does melt, it's a smoother melting ability than a fresher cheese. Okay, so your age of cheese is going to make a difference. Now remember, sometimes there's some overlap here because age of cheese also affects the moisture content in the cheese. So sometimes the longer a cheese ages, it may melt more smoothly, but you might need to help it a little bit because it's got such a low moisture content. So remember, there is some overlap between these 4 factors. Now the 4th factor is the acid content in the cheese. So the higher the acid, the stringier the cheese is going to be when it melts. Such as Swiss cheese. You know, Swiss cheese is fairly high in acid, and as it melts, it's a little more stringy than some of those lower acid cheeses that might melt more smoothly. Now, we can really take this to the extreme with a direct acidification cheese. So these are the really high acid cheeses, and they are also cheeses that are made into cheese differently. Remember at the beginning I said those direct acidification cheeses, we heat the milk up, we add an acid. Whereas most cheeses, we curdle the milk by adding culture at a lower temperature, letting that change the acidity gently in the milk, and then we add rennet and that kind of coagulates the milk. Well, those high temperature direct acidification cheeses, not only are they very acidic, but that method of curdling the cheese makes it so that those cheeses won't melt at all. All right, so think of your grilling cheeses like paneer or halloumi, or cheeses that you sometimes just put on top of a dish, or you put it in it with some other things like ricotta. That's another one that really won't melt. Or I'm going to show you another one today called French Broussais. Because the way that we've made that cheese, that direct acidification and no rennet, means that it just has no meltability. It won't melt at all. And so you can throw it on the grill, or you can saute it and it really won't melt. Or you can put it in a dish and it won't dissolve into the dish like paneer that we might put into an Indian dish. All right, so those are some of the factors that influence the meltability of cheese. Now, to put it all into context, I thought we'd do a little miniature demonstration here. So I'm going to talk about 3 of those 4 factors. And I've got 3 cheeses here. The reason I'm only going to talk about 3 is all of my personal cheeses generally are made from the same milk, which is my goat milk. And so the fat content of these cheeses is roughly the same. The moisture content is different, and the age of these cheeses is different, but it's going to be a little hard for me to just compare fat content unless I had 2 cheeses that were exactly the same in every way except for the fat content. So we're going to be talking mostly here about moisture content, age, and how acidic or how it was acidified. So we're going to take these over here to my little demonstration table. And you can see here I've got my little heat source, and I'm going to put this on about medium. So let me tell you about the 3 cheeses we're going to use today. And you can probably tell by looking at these, especially if you know anything about cheese, which of the categories these represent. So this right here is a Munster cheese. It's a washed rind cheese, which is why it's orange on the surface. And you can see it is very high moisture. All right, so this one's going to represent our high moisture content cheese. This one down here is my Montaggio, and you can just tell by looking at it, this is very low moisture, but it's also aged. Okay, so this is going to represent our lower moisture, but also our aged cheese. And then this one right here is our French Broussais. This is a fresh cheese. So in that factor of fresh versus aged, we have fresh. And it's also a direct acidification cheese. This is just basically milk and vinegar is how we made this particular cheese. So we're going to watch how these 3 cheeses melt just to demonstrate what we just talked about. So we'll start with our little French Broussais. And what you should know by now is this one's not going to melt, all right? So we're going to just set it in on our pot here, our pan, which is on about medium heat. All right, and then we're going to take our high moisture content Munster and set it here. And then I've grated some of this Montaggio, and I did this last week. If you happen to be watching, I did this on a high temperature to make frico, which is a fried version of Montaggio.